The champagne flute shattered against the marble floor, and in that crystalline moment, I watched my father being handcuffed in front of 300 of New York's financial elite. The ballroom of the Plaza Hotel fell into a silence so absolute I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Richard Sterling, the man Forbes had called the Wolf of Wall Street's smarter cousin, stood frozen as two SEC agents read him his rights. His eyes, those cold blue eyes that had looked at me with nothing but contempt for 34 years, finally found mine across the crowd. And for the first time in my life, I saw fear in them. This was my doing. I had brought down my own father's empire, exposed a $60 million Ponzi scheme, and destroyed the Sterling name forever. And God help me, I would do it again in a heartbeat. But before I tell you how I got here, before I explain how the daughter everyone dismissed as naive and soft-hearted became the woman who toppled a financial dynasty, I need you to understand something. If this story resonates with you, if you have ever felt invisible in your own family, dismissed by the people who should have believed in you most, please hit that like button. Subscribe to hear more stories about finding your power when the world tries to take it away. And comment below, tell me, have you ever had to choose between loyalty and justice? Because that is exactly the choice I faced. Now let me take you back to where this all began. I was 22 when my grandmother, Eleanor Vance, passed away. She was the only person in my family who ever truly saw me, not as a disappointing daughter or a weak link in the Sterling chain, but as someone with value beyond a balance sheet. The day after her funeral, while my mother was already redecorating grandmother's Park Avenue apartment, and my brother Daniel was calculating his inheritance, I sat in the lawyer's office and learned that Eleanor had left me something different. Not the stocks or the properties or the jewelry everyone expected. She left me $800,000 in cash and a handwritten letter that would change my life. The letter was 3 pages long, written in her elegant script on cream-colored stationery. I can still recite parts of it from memory. She wrote, "Jolie, my darling girl, by the time you read this I will be gone, but I need you to know something your father has spent your entire life trying to convince you is not true. Kindness is not weakness. Compassion is not stupidity. And wanting to build something that helps others instead of simply extracting wealth from them does not make you less intelligent or less capable than your father or brother. It makes you stronger." She went on to explain that she had watched my father build Sterling holdings on the backs of vulnerable people, watched him foreclose on family farms, and small businesses watched him destroy communities for profit margins. She had confronted him once, she wrote, 20 years ago, and he had cut her out of all business decisions from that day forward. But she had been quietly moving money aside, money that was hers inherited from her own father, the original Vance, whose name I carried. And now that money was mine with one instruction: build something better. I remember folding that letter and putting it in my purse, then walking out of that lawyer's office into a gray March afternoon in Manhattan. I did not go home to my apartment. I did not call anyone. I walked for 3 hours through Central Park, past joggers and tourists and street performers, turning over my grandmother's words in my mind. Build something better. It sounded so simple, so naive even, but it also felt like permission, like someone had finally handed me a key to a door I had been standing in front of my whole life. The problem was I had tried to open that door before. I had tried to get my family to see that business could be different, that finance could be a tool for good instead of just extraction. I was 19, home from Cornell for Thanksgiving break, sitting at our dining table in our Connecticut estate. The table could seat 18, but it was just the 4 of us that night, my parents at either end, Daniel and me facing each other across polished mahogany. I had been taking an economics class that semester with a professor who specialized in impact investing, and I was on fire with the possibilities. So over dessert, while my mother was explaining her latest charity gala and my brother was checking his phone under the table, I made my pitch to my father. I told him about microfinance programs that were lifting entire communities out of poverty, about renewable energy investments that were outperforming fossil fuels, about how Sterling Holdings could lead the way in responsible capitalism. My father let me finish. Then he set down his fork, dabbed his mouth with his napkin, and looked at me with an expression I had seen him use on failed employees. "Jolie," he said, and his voice was patient in a way that somehow felt more condescending than if he had yelled, "Finance is not a playground for idealists. It is a battlefield. The companies and people we acquire, they lose because they are weak. They make poor decisions. They do not have what it takes to survive in a competitive market. If we do not capitalize on their failures, someone else will. That is not cruelty. That is economics." "But what about the people who lose their jobs?" I asked. "What about the communities? They should have worked harder," he said, simply. They should have been smarter. The market rewards excellence, Jolie. It punishes mediocrity. If you cannot accept that you do not understand the first thing about business. My mother nodded along, adding, "Honestly, darling, this is why we were concerned about you going into economics. You have always been so sensitive. Maybe you should consider something more suitable. Art history, perhaps. Or nonprofit management if you must help people." Daniel did not even look up from his phone. That was the last time I tried to change their minds about anything. I finished my degree, graduated with honors, and took a job at a small impact investing firm in Brooklyn. Not Goldman Sachs like Daniel. Not Morgan Stanley like my father expected. A firm that managed $50 million in assets and actually cared where that money went. My family was mortified. My mother told her friends I was going through a phase. My father stopped introducing me at industry events. For the next 12 years, I learned everything I could about using capital as a force for good. I worked 80-hour weeks for a third of what I could have made at a traditional firm. I built relationships with social entrepreneurs, community development, financial institutions, renewable energy startups, and slowly, carefully, I started to understand something my father never had. There was a massive underserved market of investors who actually wanted their money to do good in the world. Not as charity, but as smart, profitable investments. The world was changing, and the old guard just could not see it yet. By the time I was 34, I had taken my grandmother's $800,000 and turned it into a $12 million fund. The Vance Foundation focused exclusively on clean energy and community development. Our returns were beating the S&P 500. We had created over 3,000 jobs in rural communities that companies like Sterling Holdings had written off as unprofitable. And I had done it all without my family's help or approval. Which brings me to that night at the Plaza Hotel 6 months ago. It was supposed to be a charity auction for child literacy, one of those glittering Manhattan events where the wealthy gather to feel good about themselves while writing tax-deductible checks. I had bought a table for $10,000 planning to network with potential investors. I did not know my parents would be there. I did not know Daniel would be there with his fiancé David, a hedge fund manager I had met exactly once at a Christmas party 3 years ago. I was standing by the bar wearing a navy Armani suit I had bought specifically to look like I belonged in these rooms when I heard my mother's voice behind me. Didn't know they let charity cases in here. I turned around and there she was, Martha Sterling, dripping in Harry Winston diamonds, looking at me like I was a stain on her Louboutins. Daniel stood next to her, uncomfortable but silent as always. And David, tall and handsome in his tuxedo, was watching our interaction with curious eyes. Before I could respond, my father materialized. Richard Sterling had a gift for arriving at exactly the moment he could inflict maximum damage. He smiled, that practiced smile he used on investors he was about to screw over, and said loud enough for the people around us to hear Jolie. "Still playing around with your little charity fund, I see. I thought you would have given up that silly hobby by now. How did you even afford a ticket to this? Did you use grandmother's money? Is there any left, or have you wasted it all on your adorable Save the World projects?" Every word was designed to cut, to diminish, to publicly remind me and everyone listening that in his eyes I was nothing but a disappointment, wasting money on pointless endeavors. Several people had turned to watch our exchange. I could feel their eyes on me, could sense them cataloging this awkward family moment for later gossip. I met my father's gaze and said nothing. I simply smiled, a small, cool smile that I had learned from watching him destroy people across negotiating tables. Then I turned to David and said quietly enough that only he could hear, "Don't judge a book by its cover, David." And I walked away, head high, heart-pounding, hands shaking with suppressed rage. That night, lying in my studio apartment in Fort Greene, a place my mother had once described as aggressively middle class, I made a decision. I was done trying to prove myself to them. I was done caring what they thought. I was going to focus on building my work, and they could think whatever they wanted about me. I had my grandmother's blessing, my own track record, and investors who believed in what I was doing. That was enough. Or so I thought. The letter arrived 72 hours later. It came via courier to my office, a small converted warehouse space in Brooklyn that I shared with 2 other impact investment firms. My assistant Maya brought it to me looking concerned. "This just came. It is from Sterling Holdings' legal department." I opened the envelope and pulled out a cease and desist order along with a demand letter. The legal language was dense, but the message was crystal clear. Sterling Holdings was accusing the Vance Foundation of unfair market practices and demanding immediate repayment of a $3 million loan, a loan I had never taken out. I read the letter 3 times, my confusion turning to understanding and then to fury. The loan they were referencing was the original $800,000 my grandmother had given me, which they had somehow calculated with a predatory interest rate to equal $3 million over 12 years. They were claiming it had been a family loan, not a gift, and they wanted it back. Immediately. Within 72 hours. But it was the handwritten note at the bottom in my father's distinctive script that made my blood run cold. Looks like our little charity girl needs to learn about real finance after all. Good luck, Jolie. Maybe this will teach you that business is not a game. He was trying to destroy me. Not just hurt me or teach me a lesson. He wanted to bankrupt the Vance Foundation to prove that I had been foolish and naive all along, that everything I had built was built on borrowed money I could not repay. And he was doing it publicly through lawyers, so that everyone in our industry would know. I called an emergency meeting with my team. There were 5 of us. Maya, my assistant who handled operations, Robert, my co-founder who specialized in renewable energy deals, Lisa, our legal counsel who had left a big firm to work with us for a fraction of her previous salary, and Marcus. Marcus Chen was our forensic accountant, a brilliant, quiet man in his early 40s who had worked for the SEC before going private. He had a particular talent for reading financial statements, the way detectives read crime scenes. I laid out the situation. Then I said I need to know if there is any legal basis for this claim. And if there is not, I need to know why my father is really doing this. Lisa spent 2 hours reviewing my grandmother's estate documents and came back with good news. The money was a gift, clearly documented. There was no loan agreement, no promissory note. This demand has no legal standing. We can fight this. But Marcus was frowning at his laptop. There is something else here. He looked up at me. Jolie, when did your father start targeting clean energy investments? About 18 months ago, I said. Sterling Holdings bought a controlling interest in 3 coal companies and 2 natural gas distributors. Why? Because the timing coincides with the Vance Foundation's biggest growth period. You have been systematically funding competitors to his fossil fuel interests. Every community solar project you back, every wind farm you invest in, it is cutting into his market share. This is not about the loan. This is about you becoming a threat. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My father was not trying to destroy me because I was an embarrassment. He was trying to destroy me because I was succeeding. Because my model was working and his was becoming obsolete. Because I was proving that everything he had built his empire on, the extraction, the ruthlessness, the fuck everyone else mentality, was not actually necessary to make money. I looked around at my team, these people who had believed in my vision enough to work for modest salaries and long hours, and I made a decision that probably should have scared me more than it did. I said I am not paying them a single dollar. Instead, we are going to fight back. And we are going to win. But I need your help, and I need you to understand that this might get ugly. They all agreed without hesitation. Over the next 3 weeks, instead of scrambling to raise $3 million, we went on the offensive. First, I called CNBC and pitched them a story. Not about the legal threat, but about impact investing and the changing landscape of finance. They booked me for their morning show. I showed up in a sharp gray suit with my hair pulled back, and I talked about the Vance Foundation's track record. I showed charts demonstrating our returns. I discussed our portfolio companies and the jobs they had created. And then, without naming Sterling Holdings, I said, there are people in this industry who are afraid of change. They have built their wealth on old models, extractive models, and they see funds like ours as a threat. They will try to discredit us to claim that doing good and making money are mutually exclusive. But our results speak for themselves. The future of finance is not about choosing between profit and purpose. It is about understanding that purpose drives profit. The interview went viral. By the end of the day, I had calls from 3 major investors wanting to put money into my fund. Forbes reached out to do a profile. And, according to Maya, our website traffic had increased by 4,000%. But more importantly, David called me. Daniel's fiancé, the hedge fund manager I barely knew. He said, I saw your interview. I had been looking into Sterling Holdings for a potential partnership, but after watching you, I started asking some questions. There are some irregularities in their financial statements. Things that do not add up. I thought you should know. I met him for coffee the next morning at a place in Midtown. He arrived with a folder full of documents. As we sat in a back corner booth, he walked me through what he had found. Discrepancies in Sterling Holdings' reported assets. Unusually high management fees being paid to offshore entities. Pension fund investments that seemed to have disappeared from the books. Why are you telling me this? I asked. A looked uncomfortable. Because Daniel is a good person who has been blind to what his father really is. Because I cannot marry into a family without knowing the truth. And because he paused, what you are doing matters. The world needs more people like you and fewer people like Richard Sterling. I took the documents back to Marcus. He spent 3 days barely sleeping, diving deep into Sterling Holdings' financial history. What he found was worse than any of us had imagined. Sterling Holdings was not just engaging in aggressive business practices. It was running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme that had been operating for at least a decade. They were using new investor money to pay returns to old investors. They had been systematically looting the employee pension fund to cover shortfalls. And they had been laundering money through a network of offshore accounts and shell corporations tied to real estate developments that did not actually exist. The total fraud was somewhere north of $60 million. Marcus looked at me across the conference room table, his face pale. Jolie, this is not just unethical. This is criminal. If we report this, your father will go to prison. Your entire family will be destroyed. Are you sure you want to do this? I thought about my grandmother's letter. I thought about the employees whose pensions had been stolen. I thought about the investors who had trusted Sterling Holdings with their retirement savings. And I thought about that moment at the charity auction, my father's contemptuous smile as he publicly humiliated me. I am sure, I said. We spent another week building an airtight case. Marcus documented every fraudulent transaction. Lisa prepared a legal memo outlining the violations, and then we contacted the SEC. The lead investigator was a woman named Jennifer Torres, a career prosecutor with a reputation for taking down white-collar criminals. She listened to our presentation, reviewed our evidence, and said, "This is one of the most comprehensive fraud cases I have seen in 15 years. We will need to verify everything independently, but if this holds up, your father is looking at serious prison time." "How long before you move?" I asked. She considered. 2 weeks, maybe 3. We will need to coordinate with other agencies. This crosses state lines, involves international money laundering. It will be a major operation. I need to be there when you arrest him, I said. She raised an eyebrow. That is unusual. I know. But he is hosting his annual Sterling Foundation Gala in 2.5 weeks. It is at the Plaza Hotel. 300 guests, all the major players in New York finance. If you are going to take him down, that is where it should happen. Jennifer Torres smiled slightly. That is bold. He has spent his entire life hiding behind respectability, using charity events and philanthropic gestures to mask what he really is. I want everyone to see the truth at the same time. I want there to be no doubt, no room for him to spin this or play the victim. She nodded. I will see what I can do. The next 2 weeks were the longest of my life. I went through the motions of running my fund meeting with investors, reviewing deals. But every night I lay awake, terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. I was about to destroy my own father. I was about to blow up my entire family. There would be no going back from this. 3 days before the gala, Jennifer Torres called. We are confirmed for the night of the event. We will have agents positioned throughout the venue. You will need to create an opportunity for us to make the arrest in a public setting. Can you do that? Yes, I said. She paused. Miss Vance, I need to ask. Are you doing this for the right reasons? Because if this is about revenge or family drama, I cannot be part of it. I understood her concern, but I also knew my answer. This is about the $60 million Richard Sterling stole. It is about the employees whose pension funds he looted. It is about the investors he defrauded. My personal feelings about my father are separate from the fact that he is a criminal who needs to be stopped. If he were anyone else, you would arrest him without a second thought. The fact that he is my father does not change what he did. Good answer, she said. The night of the gala, I arrived early with Marcus and 2 of the SEC agents dressed in evening wear. We blended into the crowd, just more wealthy New Yorkers in designer clothes, drinking champagne and making small talk. I spotted my parents across the ballroom holding court with a group of investors. Daniel was there with David, both of them looking uncomfortable in the way people do at events they feel obligated to attend. The program followed the usual pattern. Cocktails, dinner, speeches. My father took the stage around 9 o'clock to talk about Sterling Foundation's charitable work. He spoke about integrity, about responsibility, about how those of us who had been blessed with success had a duty to give back. He was magnetic, commanding. Everyone in that room was captivated by him. Everyone except me. I waited until he was mid-sentence, something about how we as leaders must be beacons of integrity in an uncertain world, and then I stood up. I walked down the aisle between tables, my heels clicking on the marble floor, every eye turning to watch me approach the stage. Marcus and the SEC agents moved into position near the exits. My father saw me coming and his eyes narrowed, but he kept talking. Until I climbed the stairs to the stage and walked up beside him. The microphone was right there. I took it from his hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, and my voice was steady, amplified across the ballroom. "I apologize for the interruption. My name is Jolie Vance Sterling. I am Richard Sterling's daughter, and I am here tonight to tell you the truth about the man you have been applauding." The room went completely silent. My father reached for the microphone, but I stepped back. Behind me, a screen descended from the ceiling. Marcus had hacked into the hotel's presentation system. My father spoke about integrity, I continued, about responsibility, about being beacons in uncertain times. But what he did not tell you is that Sterling Holdings is built on fraud. For the past 10 years, my father has been running a Ponzi scheme that has stolen over $60 million from investors and employees. The screen lit up behind me with the first slide. A simplified chart showing how money flowed through Sterling Holdings, how new investments were used to pay old investors, how the employee pension fund had been systematically drained. "You are insane," my father hissed. "Security, get her off this stage." But I kept talking louder now. "He has laundered money through offshore accounts. He has created fake real estate developments to hide stolen assets. He has destroyed the retirement savings of hundreds of his own employees. And he has done it all while standing in rooms like this, accepting awards for his philanthropy." My father lunged at me. He actually tried to grab the microphone, his face purple with rage. That is when the SEC agents moved forward. Jennifer Torres walked up onto the stage, her badge held high. "Richard Sterling, you are under arrest for securities fraud, money laundering, and wire fraud. You have the right to remain silent." The room erupted. People standing, shouting questions, cameras flashing. My father fought as they handcuffed him, screaming obscenities at me, calling me a traitor, a lying bitch, an ungrateful cunt who would rot in hell for this. But I just stood there watching, the microphone still in my hand. I looked out at the crowd and said quietly into the sudden silence as they led him away, "He destroyed himself." I just made sure everyone could see it. Then I handed the microphone to Jennifer Torres and walked off the stage. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand. Marcus caught my elbow, steadying me. "Are you okay?" he whispered. I nodded, even though I was not sure it was true. David was suddenly there, his face shocked but also strangely relieved. He pulled me aside. I had no idea it was this bad. Daniel did not know either. "You have to believe that." And then quieter, "Thank you for having the courage to do what no one else would." The legal proceedings that followed were brutal and swift. The evidence was overwhelming. The SEC filed charges. The FBI got involved because of the money laundering. The Department of Labor came after Sterling Holdings for the pension fund violations. Within 3 months, Richard Sterling was convicted on 17 counts of fraud and sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. My mother filed for divorce before the trial even started. Not because she was horrified by what he had done, but because she wanted to protect her assets. She moved to Palm Beach, cut off all contact with me, and told anyone who would listen that I had destroyed the family out of jealousy and spite. Daniel had a breakdown. A real one. He checked himself into a psychiatric facility for 6 weeks. When he came out, he was a different person. Quieter. Humbler. He called me and asked if we could meet. We sat in a coffee shop in Brooklyn, not far from my office. He looked 10 years older than he had 3 months ago. "I am so sorry," he said. "For everything. For not defending you. For not seeing what Dad really was. For being a coward." I sipped my coffee and studied my brother. I wanted to hate him. Part of me did hate him. But mostly I just felt tired. "You were raised the same way I was," I said finally. "The difference is I had grandmother telling me there was another way. You just had Dad." He nodded, tears in his eyes. "I want to help. With the employees, with cleaning up the mess. I know I do not deserve your forgiveness, but I want to try to make things right." It took me a long time to respond. "Okay," I said. "Let's try." Over the next year, Daniel and I worked together to help the victims of Sterling Holdings. We set up a victim compensation fund. We fought to get as much of the pension money restored as possible. We cooperated with investigators to unravel every piece of the fraud. It did not fix what had happened, but it was something. David became one of the Vance Foundation's biggest investors. He and Daniel got married in a quiet ceremony in Vermont, and I stood up as Daniel's best man. Family, it turned out, was something you could rebuild from scratch if you were willing to do the work. The Vance Foundation grew. With the publicity from the Sterling Holdings case, we attracted major institutional investors. Within 2 years, we were managing $200 million in assets. We expanded beyond clean energy into affordable housing, into healthcare access, into education. Every investment was designed to generate both financial returns and measurable social impact. I was invited to speak at conferences, to testify before Congress about financial regulation, to write op-eds for the Wall Street Journal. I became exactly the kind of voice in finance that my father had always dismissed as naive and impractical. And I proved over and over that doing good and making money were not contradictory goals. 5 years after that night at the Plaza Hotel, I received a letter from my father. It was short, just 5 sentences. "You should have kept quiet. You should have protected the family. You destroyed everything I built. I hope you are happy. I hope it was worth it." I read the letter once. Then I tore it into small pieces and dropped them in the recycling bin. I did not write back. There was nothing left to say to him. Instead, I went to visit one of our portfolio companies, a solar installation business in rural Kentucky that was employing people in a community where the coal mines had closed. I walked through the training facility where 50 new workers were learning to install solar panels. I met a grandmother who told me this job was saving her family. I saw with my own eyes what capital could do when it was deployed with intention and care. That night, back in my apartment, I pulled out my grandmother's letter. I had kept it in a frame on my desk for 5 years, but I rarely read it anymore. I did not need to. I had memorized every word. But that night I read it again, and one line jumped out at me. "Your greatest act of rebellion will not be against your father. It will be in proving that there was always another way." She had been right. I had not just defeated Richard Sterling. I had built something that proved his entire worldview wrong. Kindness was not weakness. Compassion was not stupidity. And wanting to help people while making money was not naive idealism. It was the future. I renamed the foundation, the Vance Sterling Foundation. Not to honor my father, but to reclaim both legacies. The Vance name represented integrity and vision. The Sterling name, well, I was turning it into something better than it had ever been. A name associated with second chances, with communities rising from the ashes of extractive capitalism, with the radical idea that business could be a force for good. 10 years after that night, I stood in another ballroom, accepting an award for lifetime achievement in impact investing. I was 44 years old. I had built a $2 billion fund. We had created over 15,000 jobs. We had helped dozens of communities transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And I had done it all without compromising my values or becoming the kind of person my father wanted me to be. In my acceptance speech, I said, "There are people who will tell you that you have to choose between success and integrity, that you have to be ruthless to survive in business, that caring about people is a liability in finance. I am here to tell you that those people are wrong. They are not just morally wrong. They are factually wrong. The data proves it. Our returns prove it. And the communities we serve prove it. You do not have to sacrifice your humanity to succeed. In fact, your humanity might be your greatest competitive advantage." The audience stood and applauded. Among them was Daniel, now running a consulting firm that helped companies implement ethical business practices, and David, who had left his hedge fund to become the CFO of the Vance Sterling Foundation, and Marcus, who I had promoted to chief risk officer after he turned down 3 offers from major banks. And in the front row, wearing a proud smile, was a young woman named Maya. Not my former assistant, but my daughter. I had adopted her 6 years ago when she was 12, after her mother, one of the employees whose pension Richard Sterling had destroyed, died of cancer. Maya was 18 now, about to start at Cornell studying economics. She wanted to work in impact investing. Of course she did. After the ceremony, she hugged me. "Mom," she said, and I never got tired of hearing that word. "You know what Grandma Eleanor would say if she could see you now?" I smiled. "What?" She would say, "I told you so." We both laughed. And she was right. Eleanor Vance had told me so. She had known all those years ago that I had it in me to build something better, to prove that another way was possible, to turn pain into purpose and rage into change. They had called me naive. They had called me weak. They had tried to destroy me. But I was still here, stronger than ever, surrounded by people I loved and work that mattered. And my father was in a prison cell, his empire in ruins, his name synonymous with fraud. Who had really won? Here is what I learned from all of this. You do not owe loyalty to people who do not respect you, even if they are family. Especially if they are family. Blood does not give anyone the right to diminish you, to use you, to treat your dreams as disposable. And when you find yourself at that crossroads, when you realize that staying means losing yourself, you have to be brave enough to walk away. Even when it is terrifying. Even when it costs you everything you thought you wanted. Because on the other side of that decision is freedom. Is the possibility of building something true and good and yours. Is the chance to prove that their limitations are not your limitations, that their cruelty does not have to be your inheritance. I looked at my father and saw a man who had built an empire on exploitation. And I said, no, I will build something different. And it was the hardest thing I ever did. And it was worth every single sleepless night, every moment of doubt, every relationship I lost along the way. So let me ask you, have you ever had to choose between loyalty and truth? Between protecting your family and protecting your values? If you have, I want to hear about it. Comment below and share your story. Because these conversations matter. Because knowing we are not alone in these impossible choices matters. And if this story meant something to you, if it gave you courage or hope or just the feeling that someone understands, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories about finding your power, setting boundaries, and refusing to let anyone dim your light. Because you deserve to shine. And the world deserves to see what you build when you stop playing by their rules and start playing by your own.